Hello and welcome to Unpacking Terms. The terms we're going to be unpacking today are implicit, explicit knowledge. And what I'll present here is a very simplified version of the great work by many SLA scholars, including Nick Ellis, Rod Ellis, Bill Van Patten, Michael Long, and many more. There's been a lot of books and articles written on the topic of implicit and explicit knowledge. I'll start with the easiest one to define, and that would be explicit knowledge. Explicit refers to something conscious, something that we're aware of, that can be verbalized, that people can tell you this is what they know. Usually in SLA, it refers to rules and patterns about the language, usually grammar rules. And sometimes it can be verbalized using metalinguistic information or metalinguistic terms. So what is metalinguistic? That means about the language itself. So for example, when we use terms such as direct object or nominative versus accusative case, etc. And then you have implicit knowledge, and that would be knowledge that is outside of awareness. It cannot be verbalized, so somebody cannot tell you what they know implicitly. It is often described with the word intuitive, and it is what underlies spontaneous communication and also comprehension. Right now, as you read this slide, as you listened to me, you processed all sorts of structures without even thinking about it. So the big question is there a link between explicit and implicit knowledge? One position is the no interface position. An interface refers to this link between explicit and implicit knowledge. A big name in this camp is Krashen. And the no interface position essentially says that explicit and implicit knowledge are two totally different types of knowledge, and one doesn't influence the other. And for the no interface position, explicit learning or learning about the language, learning the rules, only results in explicit knowledge. So this camp thinks that any type of explicit learning will not influence your implicit knowledge. And this explicit knowledge, this knowledge of rules and knowledge about the language, is only helpful for monitoring your own production, for self-correcting, if you will. But they do not see any other role for explicit knowledge. Then we have the weak interface position, names such as Ellis, Long, and several others. As you can probably guess, the weak interface position says that maybe there's a link. They do acknowledge that it's different, right? That explicit and implicit knowledge are not the same, and they are indeed different. But one might influence the other. And a hallmark of the weak interface position is that they believe that focus on form, which we explored in another video, and that would be conscious attention to form, can help. Remember that focus on form singular is not the same as simply teaching rules and practicing. And then we have the strong interface position. A big name in this camp would be De Keyser. And as you can probably guess by the name strong interface, meaning that there's a strong link between explicit and implicit knowledge, yes, they believe that practice can make perfect, and practice in the sense of explicit learning. A big difference between the strong interface position and the other two positions is that the strong interface position is based on the premise that learning a language is the same as learning anything else. And I would say that most SLA scholars do not agree with that premise. And if you're wondering why it's so hard to have a definitive answer in terms of whether explicit knowledge affects or influences in any way our implicit knowledge, the main issue is that not everybody agrees with what constitutes evidence of implicit knowledge, or even if we can measure implicit knowledge. Now, what all of these camps probably agree with is that we want our learners to develop implicit knowledge. So how do we develop implicit knowledge? The simplest answer, and again, the one thing that everybody probably agrees with, is that it's through implicit or incidental learning, which is learning without intention and without awareness. And all of these camps also agree that babies learning their first language are learning implicitly. Now, what about adults learning their second language or an additional language? The no interface camp would probably tell you that it's the same, that acquisition is acquisition is acquisition. The weak interface position will tell you that it's not quite the same, that adults learning an additional language is not the exact same identical process as a baby learning their first language. And the topic of L1 versus L2 acquisition is indeed much bigger and something that we can unpack in another video. The purpose of this video is just to clarify this contrast between implicit and explicit. Something else that is important to clarify is the difference between implicit and inductive learning. Inductive learning methods, which usually involve discovering the rule or the pattern based on examples, based on input, are essentially one form of explicit learning. Even if you're not using the metalinguistic terms, even if you're not saying things like, that's the direct object, or this is an irregular verb. Even if you're not using those terms, you are still verbalizing rules. You're still verbalizing patterns. We need to remember that implicit learning means without intention or awareness. Something else that all camps agree with is that implicit learning takes more time than explicit learning. There's no doubt about it. So the big question is, can explicit instruction speed things up? Once again, different camps tell you different things. The no interface position will probably tell you no, just be patient. You need time and you need continuous, prolonged engagement with the language meaningfully. And the weak interface, once again, will tell you maybe. Now, the weak interface does acknowledge that instruction cannot change the order of acquisition, cannot change the developmental sequences, which we talked about in the first video. But the weak interface position does say that perhaps this conscious attention to certain forms can help us move along those stages a little bit quicker. One thing that the no interface and the weak interface position will definitely agree with is that rules plus practice does not equal acquisition. And the no interface and the weak interface position also agree that acquisition is a mostly implicit process, that the bulk of acquisition happens implicitly. Of course, the no interface position thinks that it's entirely implicit, but if we were to find some common ground between these two camps, it would be that the nature of acquisition is mostly, mainly, primarily implicit. And I like this quote by Rod Ellis, who says that the process of learning a language would become impossible if every rule out of the thousands that comprise the grammar of a language had to be first learned as explicit knowledge. This highlights again that the bulk of acquisition, language acquisition, is implicit. The takeaway for me is then that we need to prioritize understanding content over understanding rules. We need to focus much more on the ideas that we're sharing, on the what, as opposed to always leading with how, with grammar, with form, and then have content be sort of an afterthought. There's certainly a lot more to unpack. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.